General Hayden is the only person to serve as both the Director of the Central Intelligence Agency and the Director of the National Security Agency. He was the nation's first principal Deputy Director of the National Intelligence and a 4-star general, was the highest-ranking intelligence officer in the United States Armed Forces. He has served as Commander of the Air Intelligence Agency and the Director of the Joint Command and Control Warfare Center. In addition, he has held senior staff positions at the Pentagon, U.S. European Command, and National Security Council, as well as the Embassy in Bulgaria. He was the Deputy Chief of Staff for the United Nations Command and the U.S. Forces in South Korea. A New York Times best-selling author, he is a frequent guest on national news outlets for his unparalleled expertise in cyber intelligence, counterintelligence, and global political and terrorist risk analysis. Besides being photographed with Rich Davis, his honors include the Defense Distinguished Service Medal, the Defense Superior Service Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster, the Legion of Merit, the Bronze Star Medal, and he was the inaugural recipient of the Helms Award presented by the CIA Officers Memorial Foundation. He has had the privilege of informing decision-makers across administrations and has upheld the highest principles and traditions of speaking truth to power. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming General Michael Hayden.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, that's good. Let's see how you feel after I'm done. Well, thanks for the opportunity to come be among family and friends again. This is really quite a wonderful evening. Now, I've got a bit of a daunting task here. I'm supposed to talk about security to a room full of security professionals. So I'm going to take a little bit of a different aspect in terms of what it is I will attempt to share with you tonight. Not so much telling you about my observations on your business, which I really don't feel qualified to do, but to enlist you in a broader enterprise within the United States, where you take your expertise and make it part of a broader, richer, healthier national dialogue. So let me just jump in here. When I usually get invited to trade associations or something, they want me to do global geopolitics. So my first slide I generally put up is just 3 main points. It's what my Army buddies, I learned this in Korea, what my Army buddies would call the big hand little map slide, you know, where you just go like that. And I've got 3 points on there. Number 1, I've actually lived in a world more dangerous than today. And I look around and remember some of the folks, we had some photographs in the cocktail party before. There are people of similar age here who have actually can share that thought. Remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was a captain in America's Air Force when we went to DEFCON 3 in 1973 because we thought the Soviets were pushing men and material to their Arab allies. So I've actually seen it more dangerous. I've never seen it more complicated. And, you know, if you wanted me to fill up the space here for the 20 allotted minutes, I could do it just giving you the batting order in Syria. All right, not doing any play-by-play, not doing any box score, just lining up the players. The battlefield is that complicated. So I've seen it more dangerous, never more complicated, and frankly, I've never seen it what I would call more immediate. All right, and by this I mean not just we get to see the cell phone video on our favorite news network that evening, but that when something happens over here, things go bump over here inside the United States. So more dangerous, probably. I'm getting a little shakier on that one, frankly, as time goes by. Never more complicated, never more immediate. And so I get asked, what keeps me awake at night? And I can rattle off the usual statements. You know, will the North Koreans go to zero? And if they won't, can we still negotiate an acceptable arms control agreement? Can we get international consensus to really get people on side with regard to the Iranians? Can we continue with our counterterrorism success, which frankly I attribute to 3 successive administrations? What about the Russians? I'm fond of saying the Russians are dangerous not because they're strong, but because they're not. The Russians are dangerous because they know they're playing with a pair of sevens, and they bet very aggressively. You realize there are 3 states in the United States that individually have economies larger than the Russian Federation. But you've got a president there who's playing that hand very aggressively. And then, of course, there are the Chinese, which really are a resurgent power. And we've certainly seen China become more autocratic and more aggressive in the last several years. So there's a lot going on. And as I said at the beginning, I could dwell on any one of those and share thoughts, but you're security professionals. You look at these things day in and day out, too. So I want to talk to you about a broader question. And as I suggested, it's an invitation for you to join in a broader national discussion about what it means to be a secure America. So I tell a story. So more than 2 years ago now, I got invited. I was on a panel up in Baltimore. The Republican members of the House and Senate were having an offsite. They do this every year. The next year it was in Philadelphia. Last year they were doing it at the Broadmoor. Recall the accident where the train carrying them hit a large vehicle en route to West Virginia? That meeting. And what the Republicans try to do is build consensus on core issues. I was on a national security panel and really honored to be there. Ray Odierno, former chief of America's Army, Mike Chertoff, former Secretary of Homeland Security, Ryan Crocker, ambassador extraordinaire in all the world's really tough places, Bob Kagan, who's an accomplished historian at Brookings, and then myself. Now, first of all, any of you who watch CNN after 7 o'clock at night know that 5 people on a panel is way too many. Okay. And we're up there on stage, and we got a moderator asking us questions, and you're all listening here very, very respectfully and quietly. Republicans aren't that way, all right? They started throwing their own questions at the moderator. Then they skipped the moderator and started throwing questions at us. And then they didn't even pay attention to us. They went back and forth with one another. At which point, Kagan, who is the Brookings historian, Bob kind of stands up, puts his arms out, kind of like Moses coming down from Sinai, and says, look, what's going on here is the melting down of the post-World War II American liberal Bretton Woods World Bank IMF world order. Huh? I remember thinking, damn, Bob, that's really good. It is, and it's dying a natural death because the world on which that post-World War II order was based, frankly, no longer exists. And so the institutions that served our security for the last 75 years are no longer as relevant as they once were to the security problems we now have. By the way, I think this audience knows more than most I talk to, that security established post-World War II, liberal, so on and so forth, that's got stamp Made in America on it. It reflects American diplomacy, American statecraft, American ideals, and frankly, it's nurtured by American power. But it's losing its relevance. And so the really big question that we now are debating, and it doesn't come out this way when we argue with one another, it comes out in uglier ways, but I think fundamentally this is the issue at hand for all of us, is we Americans did so well on 1.0. I mean, the last 75 years have been, get this now, and I know all the unforced errors, but the last 75 years have been the most peaceful, most long-lived, most prosperous, best educated, and healthiest 75 years in the history of the human species. And if you invite me back in 300 years, I'm sure we can quote historians who actually give American statecraft and power good marks for that. But now the world's question. The world's question is, good job on 1.0. Where are you guys on 2.0? What is it you Americans think your role is in terms of what it was your role used to be? As you know, my wife Janine is here at the head table. We spent Saturday, Sunday, and Monday, just the last 3 or 4 days, we spent it in Normandy. And we walked through the American cemetery there. We walked Omaha Beach. We walked through Pointe du Hoc. We walked through Utah Beach. And nothing can better symbolize, represent for me what we Americans did for the good of the order over the last 75 years. I was at a trade show. I was at a trade show in Norway in late August, and a fellow there, as I was walking through the displays, recognized me, I think, from CNN. We had a nice chat. And at the end of it, this Norwegian gentleman simply said to me, "I grew up in a world in which a great and powerful nation wished my country well. I'm not sure my grandchildren live in that world." And so we have this question in front of us as Americans as to what is it the role should be as we go forward. And obviously it's important to the Korean question and the Iranian question and terrorism in China and Russia, but fundamentally, what is it we think we ought to be doing? And I'm going to give you some issues here now, and I have a view on each of the issues I'm going to give you. I have a view, but that's not important. What's important is that these are now issues. What I'm going to give you have been assumptions for American foreign policy for the last American security policy for the last 75 years. And now these assumptions are being challenged. Fair enough. Game on. These are legitimate questions. As I said, I have a view on each of them, but these are legitimate questions, and these are the questions that we are now debating amongst ourselves, and very often not in a very nice way. Number one, the role of alliances, which I think for the last 75 years we viewed as a strategic advantage and not a burden. I have a little parlor trick I try on folks saying, okay, think for me now, all the countries that are important and that are truly allies of the Russian Federation. Time's up. And I can do the same parlor trick for China. But the question now becomes, at what point, where do we put the fulcrum in the question of alliances between advantage and burden? We have the same kind of question with regard to trade and international trade organizations. For the last 75 years, we have broadly supported as much free trade as possible. And now that is a legitimate question that's being asked by parts of the American polity. And then finally, there's a question of immigration. Again, for most of our history, not all of it, we viewed immigration as a net positive. It made us younger, it made us more entrepreneurial than we would otherwise be, not to mention the food that we have in the country now. Okay? But that's a fair question. Back to where do we put the fulcrum in terms of immigration as an advantage or immigration as a danger? And by the way, that immigration question has a subtext to it as well. What does it mean to be an American? For most of our history, we've believed we are a creedal nation. In other words, we're identified by that in which we believe. There are other countries around the world, good countries, democratic countries, who more take their national identity from blood, soil, and shared history. Are we shifting in that direction? So there are fundamental questions that need to be resolved, even as folks like you working every day in government or in the private sector have to handle the weighty questions of the moment, the weighty questions of the day. Let me end, and then I'm going to sound a little bit like a college professor here, largely because I'm now a college professor, okay, and not the director of CIA. But I guess what I'm asking you is, given your knowledge, given your experience, given your appreciation for the world, for fact-based decision-making, for the need for good decisions with regard to security, I want you to play more. I want you to be part of the dialogue. And what do I mean by that? I mean, don't scream at your aunt or uncle at Thanksgiving, all right? I mean, sit there and talk it through because you have something to offer. And let me give you a way of thinking about what's rolling out here that, isn't Republican or Democrat or blue or red or neocon or alt-right. And here, as I said, I'm going to default to being a college professor and quote a wonderful scholar, Walter Russell Mead, who actually says, you know what, we've had these discussions before, and you can pretty much bin American presidents when it comes to security policy. You can pretty much bin them in one of four categories. He said, and by the way, he puts a name of an historic personage on top of each category. He said, we've had presidents who have been Hamiltonian. Okay, Hamilton, Washington's aide de camp, first Secretary of the Treasury, good songwriter, beautiful voice. I've seen him in New York. Hamiltonian policy, America cannot be free unless America is prosperous. America cannot be prosperous unless America is strong. Freedom, prosperity, strength. Connect the dots. Mitt Romney would have been a Hamiltonian president because what I just said, Hamilton didn't say. Mitt Romney did during one of the debates during his run for the presidency. We've had Wilsonian presidents. American idealism, the war to make the world safe for democracy, to war to end all wars. Right? Kind of American manifest destiny from the 19th century, repackaged into a 20th and 21st century export version. The president I mostly served, George W. Bush, I think had a powerful streak of Wilson in him. Listen to the second inaugural, the Freedom Agenda. Okay. Third class that Mead lays out is Jeffersonian. Now, Jeffersonians, now I understand, Jefferson bought Louisiana, fought a war in North Africa, but fundamentally he was inward turning. He was the original shining city on the hill guy. We got lots of work to do here. Don't need to be distracted by that stuff over here. I think President Obama trended Jeffersonian, particularly in the second term. That's how you get the tide of wars receding, Al-Qaeda's on the run, and it's time to do nation building at home. Okay. Then the fourth model, so I've gotten Hamiltonian, Wilsonian, Jeffersonian. The last is Jacksonian. Andrew Jackson, a man of the people, frontiersman, first Democrat in the White House, and it doesn't matter whether you spell the Democrat with a big D or a little d, he's the first. All right. Mead's description of Jacksonian foreign policy, I use my words here rather than his. Jacksonian foreign policy is kind of organized around the concept of, organized around Robert De Niro's immortal line in Taxi Driver, okay? You talking to me? Or a foreign policy that's driven by, don't make me stop this car. And frankly, I think President Trump unarguably trends Jacksonian. Now, we can argue as to which of those policies make sense. Okay? By the way, the post-World War II consensus, the one that was steady for 75 years, was largely the Hamiltonians and the Wilsonians, the commercial guys and the idealists. And the only argument they had was whether or not we do this for our ideals or for our self-interests. And the Jacksonians, remember the don't make me stop this car kind of folks, they fight our wars, by the way. They joined the post-World War II consensus because they feared the Russians. And with the fall of the wall and the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, the Jacksonians pulled away from the national consensus. They pulled back into the national consensus after 9/11. And so we had strong unity with regard to our foreign policy. And then as those wars went on, and their kids largely fought it and suffered and died in it, the Jacksonians backed away from the national consensus. So why do I tell you all this? I tell you all this to emphasize although we can argue as to which of these models is best for us now, these are all legitimately American. And so when we have our discussions at Thanksgiving, or wherever we have these discussions, we need to understand the legitimacy of others' views, the relevance of others' views, and the importance of our participating in a civilized, fact-based, reasoned, less emotional conversation. And that is the task I leave to you tonight. Thank you.